We all see those cheap bundles of motherboards and graphics cards included together in a sale on eBay. But what happens when you buy the cheapest one you can find for £7 and try and use it in 2025? Right, so we're back with another cheap bundle, this time being a complete set of PC parts, including motherboard, processor, RAM, and graphics card, that cost me just £7. Now, I was buying it based off this picture here, and it didn't exactly give me much hope for what it'd be coming with. But the only way to find out what we've actually got and whether or not this was a good deal is to find out whether this £7 gaming bundle is actually any good. So let's get this open. One, two, What have we got this time? I can see we've got a Sunon fan. It's actually packaged quite well. We've got the graphics card. We'll open that in a second. And then we've got the main parts here. We've also got a SATA cable and a bag of screws. That is also the world's smallest SATA cable. So let's see, what motherboard have we got? I can already see green. For this money, can we really complain? I hope it survived shipping, because Every left this outside overnight, along with a load of other packages. They delivered at 11 o'clock at night. But we've got the motherboard. It's a Dell motherboard. How much RAM have we got? 2 gigabytes. And another 2 gigabytes. So that's not awful. And nothing about it looks particularly interesting. Can we see what processor we've got? Now, I did buy this as the basis of something else I've got planned, but I figured the best way of testing it would be to look at it as the parts that we actually just get sent, because I don't need all these parts. There's a processor under there. We have got the original Dell thermal paste from whenever this was put on, apparently. What is that? Can we make out what that is? Oh, it's Sandy Bridge. We've got a Core i5-2400. They're like cockroaches, but they're good. We've got the graphics card. It looks more like a display adapter, but it's still a dedicated graphics card. It is a Pegatron unit. It literally says right there. It is a 6450 Radeon. Once again, Terrascale continues to haunt me with these cheap bundles, but it's got a fan on it, which is good for a 6450. And if it's an OEM unit, that usually means they are rather well binned, so we can probably overclock it. And I've got a fun story about these, which I'm sure I'll get into. That's not bad. So we've got a 6450 graphics card, a motherboard, which is 1155, Core i5-2400, and 4 gigs of RAM, and a cooler, and a stupid fan, all for £7. I suppose we plug it in and see if it does anything. Step one, of course, will be giving the processor some thermal paste, because I got rid of the ancient thermal paste that was on here. So we'll go ahead and add in our 6450 graphics card. We want this fan on here because it came with it, so why wouldn't we use it? We got power. Oh, we'll give it all of the power. We'll give it this extra one as well. So we can actually use HDMI. Now we'll see if it turns on real quick. No, yes. It's ramped up to full speed immediately. There's no display from the system. Oh. Display connected to a disabled video connector. I have never seen this screen before. This will be the one. This is the one that's going to work. Clean the contacts and try clicking it in again. Let's try that now. That, of course, that worked. Okay, it's an Inspiron system. We're on. We're working. We're live. We're doing something. We know it's from an Inspiron. Let's plug in a hard drive, a keyboard, and a mouse, and see what it does next. So we are going to use the SATA cable it came with because it's this lovely blue one, which means we can use the blue port. Now, I've been debating what operating system to run on here because it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the Core i5-2400, as we know, is very capable, but at the same time, we got 4 gigs of RAM. So I'd think Windows 7. But Windows 7 has such limited support now from every time I've tested it that as much as I love it, it's not that the games won't launch, it's the launchers won't launch. Windows 10 is boring, and the only other option in that is Windows 11, which is at least modern, I suppose. Linux-wise, which will definitely be a comment, this is a Terrascale 2 graphics card. It has DirectX 11 support, and that is where it tops out. There is no DirectX 12, there is no Vulkan, there is nothing interesting about this card. It isn't worth it. Sure, if you wanted something that could go online, great excuse. But we have a graphics card, so objectively we want to use it. If I want to Google something, I will go on my phone. So, yes, we're going to be using Windows 11 because that's the most modern thing this can run, and we are going to be using the cut-down IoT version. The problem is I was using that USB stick to turn it on, and now I've got rid of it. So prepare for the fans to go insane. So given I have got other plans in mind for this pile of parts, not so much this or this, but I wanted to cover this in its own video first. One, just for my own knowledge that it works, and two, because it's always a little bit interesting. Now I do actually have just a little bit of a soft spot for the 6450. When I did work experience about 10 years ago, I was in charge of clearing out a load of parts from systems, and loads of parts were going away to be recycled. I had tons of these to get rid of, and they were all just going to be binned. But at the time, they were worthless at CEX, but they were worth about £3–4 each. So rather than them going to the bin, one actually did end up featuring on the channel, and the rest got traded in for vouchers that went to buy other things for the channel from CEX back in the day. So I'm quite fond of the 6450, for how much it helped the channel in its early years by being sold rather than going into the bin. And that's my little story on the 6450. Well, other than a system fan error that got initiated for some unknown reason, fans not working at all anymore, that took next to no time at all. There we go. That's not good. There we go. It's on top now. So we're already at the desktop. That was speedy. Can we add in a Wi-Fi adapter? We've still got RAM left over. We've still got processor usage left over. Just go online real quick. So I'm going to have to shout over the noise of the fans. And they calm down again, but I don't think there's any modded drivers, so we'll just go for the official ones. It's back again. Can we download these, please? Can we get hardware monitor? I'm kind of curious on what temperatures this is running at now. It doesn't seem like it's throttling, like I'm not getting any sense that the PC is slowing down at all. As a set of parts getting around, it's fine. I always assumed it was going to be fine once I saw that Core i3. I was a little bit worried on the 4 gigs of RAM, because 4 gigs is not much RAM, especially in 2025, but honestly, with this cut down version, we're still doing fine. The most RAM usage we've got is the anti-malware executable service. What is running so hot? Nothing. It is running at 39 degrees. Have we got any control? In fact, we can even see it's only using 36 watts. And they're back. What temperature did it get up to for that to go up to that? So once it hits 46 degrees, it ramps the fans up back down to 35 degrees, and then the fans cool down again. That's not going to get infuriating. That is going to get very old very quick. These drivers are still being extracted. How's it managing with all this? Okay, it's going up, but we're still not using all our RAM, and we're still not using all our processor. Now, I know that Windows 11, especially the IoT version, does actually have a new RAM management engine where it will close down system services to bring down RAM usage overall. And I'm curious how that translates to gaming, because this is sort of the ideal system for us to test it with, because with only 4 gigabytes, the 6450 is still going to be a huge limit. But 4 gigs of RAM is not much. Let MSI Afterburner go through and do its thing. Then once all that's installed, we can do a little bit of overclocking, and we should have this awful, awful system all set up and ready to go. And it didn't take very long, which is nice. Given that we have actually covered the Core i5 in here in its own video, there's plenty that can be said about it, but more or less what you need to know is that Core i5 is still really competent in 2025. It's worthless, but it will get you by. In terms of the Radeon 6450, we haven't looked at one of those in absolutely years. In terms of specifications, the 6450 is actually a Terascale 2 base card, 40 nanometers. It's more or less a slightly up-end version of the 5450 with better specifications. The version we've got here actually has a fan, but that doesn't do much when it has 160 shading units. This one's got 1 gigabyte of GDDR3, which is actually better than most have, and it all runs to a 64-bit memory bus. We've got 4 ROPs, 8 TMUs, it's an OEM unit. That's as exciting as it gets. And if you're wondering if it was running hot, it's running at 36 degrees. So no, it's not. In the meantime though, to all the people that complain about Windows 11 on low-end hardware, yes, it's not as speedy as Linux, but we are doing multitasking and plenty of other bits while installing multiple programs, and our processor is taking more of a beating from the virus scan than anything else on the system. RAM usage is low, and we've got the web open, we've got multiple installers. It is working okay, and this is just on 4 gigabytes of RAM. So Windows is a viable option, that's all I'm trying to say. Everyone should know the Core i5-2400 by now. Sandy Bridge, 32 nanometers, 4 decent cores at 3.1 gigahertz. It isn't the most exciting thing in the world, but it is a very solid, very stable, very cheap processor that just carries on chugging on. And we got one just thrown in here today with this bundle, so I can't really complain. Motherboard is just a generic Dell one. It's got PCIe 2, that's something. And then we've got our 4 gigs of DDR3 running in dual channel. One is a Hynix, the other one is also a Hynix one, so not very exciting. All the parts here date from 2011. Even the graphics card is dated 2011, so this is 2011 hardware. Exactly, even down to the motherboard we're using. Would I recommend going to get an OEM motherboard? Given the fan control issues on this one, probably not. But as long as you don't mind talking over your fans, you're doing fine. Now I might as well get it out of the way already and just say that general usage on the system, even with 4GB of RAM, well, it proved to be pretty much fine. Too much multitasking would of course make things slow down because of course we do only have 4GB of RAM. But in general, web browsing, downloading programs, installing applications, anything you'd actually just want a basic computer to do, well, it tended to deal with it absolutely fine. You could speed things up a little bit more by disabling Microsoft Defender, but after it had run its initial scan, it didn't really slow down things actually too much more than just leaving things as it was. It's also probably worth noting as well that I did try and do an overclock, and I did film a fully voiced over segment going through it, but really it's just me adjusting through the clocks until we can get things as good as they need to be. We did try and unlock voltage control, but even on an OEM 6450, you get no control over these things. But we did at least extend the overclocking limits and actually got a really rather respectable overclock, with 1 GHz on memory and a rather sizable increase to the core clocks as well. Really, this is still a turd of a graphics card, but it's one that I actually do have quite a lot of admiration for, given that it does have some gaming credentials, or at least it used to. But it's been years since we tested this graphics card, and it's nice to do it with an overclock. When it came to running 3D Mark on the system, apparently this was now ranked legendary with how high we'd managed to clock the thing. So it turns out if you do want to overclock a 6450, it turns out these Dell units actually overclock quite well. I mean, seeing actually say legendary performance wasn't exactly something I was expecting to see, given the frame rate we actually saw going through 3D Mark, but it let us see that the thermals on the system were fine, the boost clocks were working fine, and actually our graphics card was passing through very well. So we had the system all set up and working. For people wondering on that fan situation though, well, I did try and resolve things. There's no options to fix that in the BIOS, I went through it completely, and there's no options to control what level the fan should come on. I tried a factory reset, I tried taking out the CMOS battery. It just seems like this motherboard wants to keep this processor running as cool as it can, and at the moment it goes over 45 degrees, it tries to bring it back down to 35 degrees, and it does do it successfully, just with the hell of a racket getting to that point. I did try a BIOS update, as I found one listed on Dell's website, and after enough tinkering around with the actual install application, because you have to do it through an exe file, we did eventually get a new BIOS on there, which proceeded to do absolutely nothing and gave us no additional controls. So when it comes to the fan speed control on this motherboard, I'm assuming it's just a bit broken, or there's something wrong with it, or maybe there's something not plugged in that it needs as a temp sensor control unit. Either way, the motherboard knows the processor isn't using much power and isn't overheating, it just wants to constantly run the fans at that speed. So it seems like we've got everything all set up and working. Now, as I said, I did want some of these parts for a project that I've got in mind later this month. But in the meantime, as a set of components for £7, we've got what is an okay motherboard, albeit one with some problems. We've got a decent processor, 4GB of RAM, and that Radeon 6450, which for £7, I mean, that's not a bad amount of power there. It's essentially a full Dell system from 2011, just with no case. So you're essentially getting an okay-ish computer for next to nothing. You just got to run it on top of a cardboard box. To try and eke out some extra performance, mostly because I was concerned about the little amount of RAM we had with the system, I did create a bat file to try and reduce the Steam RAM usage from the web helper files, and that did tend to reduce our RAM usage by just a little bit more. We also ran Steam primarily with the tiny mode enabled, which also helps bring down RAM usage. But the real question, and the reason we're all here today, when you take just £7 of what are essentially garbage components, bought for random off eBay, can they actually do anything when you throw them up into the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 with the legacy version running with normal settings and soft shadows enabled. Now, we did have to run the game in 360p just to stabilise our frame rate, as in 720p, well, things were a little bit hitchy in places and it wasn't all too pleasant. But after setting the frame scaling on half and not having to tweak around with the INI file, we actually got a surprisingly playable experience with 39 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 31 FPS. Now, the one thing that you're probably noticing as much as I'm noticing is, why is this running smoothly on 4GB of RAM? Well, I did go through and test with a quick Windows 10 install as well, and it does seem like the RAM management in Windows 11, especially on these low-end systems, now we are running a heavily cut down version to be fair, but so was the version of Windows 10 that I tested, and the RAM usage here, and the allocation, well, it seems marginally better on Windows 11 and actually offered us a smooth experience which we didn't get over on Windows 10, which is quite admirable given that this is 4GB of RAM and a glorified display adapter from 2011. The Core i5 in the system, well, that was dealing with things absolutely fine. So given that the single player experience was completely playable, how are things in the world of online, which really does require more than 4GB of RAM? Well, things were okay at first, seeing around 30 FPS on average, which did impress me given this was a full lobby with 32 players actively in it. So this is a worst case scenario for the system. We did actually see graphics card utilization pretty good here. It wasn't exactly straying away from 100% and it needed to give 100%. The only issue we did run into was large explosions causing a rather momentary dip in the frame rate down to absolutely nothing. After this had happened a few times, it did actually resolve itself and the issue didn't crop up again, but it's worth keeping in mind that can happen. Still, I was just impressed to see a full lobby of GTA 5 Online actually working okay on this set of hardware. I was quite eager to test Mount & Blade Bannerlord because I've not really tested it on hardware that is this low end, and it did take a little bit of tweaking around, but nothing out of the game. This was all set with settings available to you in the game, and with low settings in 360p, we did manage to get the game locked to 30 FPS during the large battle benchmark. Now, it could stray away from this slightly, but it was never too much, and once you'd actually gone through it once, all the hitches and stutters did vanish. So it was quite impressive to see Mount & Blade Bannerlord working. We did have to cap the frame rate externally using MSI Afterburner, otherwise this led to the processor and the graphics card all trying to do two different things at once, because this processor can chuck out a lot more frames than the graphics card can handle. So everything was a little bit of a mess until we capped the frame rate, but Mount & Blade Bannerlord did run on what is a £7 set of hardware. Now, unfortunately, given this is a Terascale based display adapter, not that I really want to call it a graphics card, it can't actually launch Counter-Strike 2. I did try a few workarounds which apparently used to work back in the day, but unfortunately none of them seem to work anymore. So I opted for Counter-Strike Source, given that this is the type of hardware that should get you a pretty decent experience. And it really did. With low textures but everything else set to high in 720p, we saw an average of over 100 FPS most of the time, with a really solid and steady frame rate. Once again, the 6450 was the limit in the system, but we weren't exactly encroaching in on the RAM limit or the processor limit here, so with a graphics card upgrade, well, this could definitely go even further. I mean, you could say that about the previous titles, but here in Counter-Strike Source it was nice to see us actually achieve a high definition resolution and over 100 frames on average. When it comes to the original City Skylines, it is still a very popular title, to some people still more popular than the second game, and it is still one of those games that people want me to test on low-end hardware because it is meant to actually run on it. And how does it fare on a £7 set of hardware from eBay? Well, with low settings and anisotropic filtering to try and keep things looking somewhat okay, in the 640x480 resolution, we saw the game actually being somewhat playable with 36 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 24 FPS, and I've got plenty of gameplay to prove it was actually playable. It didn't exactly look good, you couldn't read the text on screen, so you'd have to know what you were actually doing to ensure this was playable, but if this was your only option, well, this is the most modern city builder you can actually play and enjoy on the system. Now, originally I did try BeamNG with our usual benchmark map, and unfortunately things went a bit wrong. With no matter what you did with the settings, you were going to be seeing anywhere from 11 to 15 FPS on average, which was smooth enough that you could actually control the game, but we had to go back to simpler maps like The Hill to actually achieve a playable 39 FPS on average with a remarkably decent set of frame times, which was the same regardless of map. It tended to run alright. The Core i5 was doing absolutely nothing. In fact, it was one of the few times the fans didn't ramp up to crazy on the system because it was doing so little. Things didn't exactly look great with low settings in 576p, but it was playable. Simpler maps than this though would run at anywhere from 50 to 60 FPS, and more intensive maps, as you've just seen, were more or less unplayable. I do feel like with the ongoing arguments of optimization, we do tend to forget that Skyrim in its original form was actually a really well optimized title that will even run on a display adapter from the time of its launch. So we were saying this was a, around £30 graphics card when it came out, maybe even less than that, and you would be seeing this game run in low textures with medium settings and 720p in the resolution range, which is a really decent looking experience given everything else we've seen so far. Keep in mind we did see around 32 FPS on average, but this could drop down to the mid-20s when there was lots going on and you were outside. Generally when you were inside though, you'd be seeing anywhere from 40 to 50 FPS, so for Skyrim, well, at least you can enjoy the game in a high-definition resolution. Now, one game I've wanted to start including into the benchmark suite for a little while now, especially on these lower-end and cheaper systems, is Metal Gear Solid 5, because I remember the Fox engine, which is the engine I believe this game uses, was incredibly well optimized for the visuals it produces. And here, well, it goes to show that you're not exactly going to be seeing many games look this good at their low settings while being almost playable on what is a glorified and overclocked display adapter. With low settings in 1024x768, we saw 25 FPS on average, which is not necessarily what I'd call a spectacular frame rate, but given it ran with such excellent frame times and actually was controllable with little in the way of notable input lag, you can actually play Metal Gear Solid 5 surprisingly well on hardware this low. I was actually really surprised how scalable the engine is, so I think on lower end hardware, we are definitely going to have to take a look at how this game performs. Now, some people are probably looking at this and thinking, Rimworld, why is this a test for the system at all? Well, the Core i5-2400 was stressed out running larger and multiple colonies at full speed, but that was always going to be the case, given that this is still a Sandy Bridge architecture part. When it came to the graphics card though, it was taking a bit of a beating with the default settings in 1080p. Given this is a 2D game, I do believe it actually operates on a 3D engine, which is how it does the shadows and the nice lighting and bits and pieces like that. So the 6450, admittedly it did achieve a playable frame rate in 1080p, but you weren't going to be seeing 60 FPS here, and for once it wasn't because the processor was struggling, it's because the graphics card was struggling to render this game in 1080p. Now it's still admirable given that this is a rather nice looking 1080p game, but still, if you want to see a full 60 FPS until the processor struggles, you have to drop things down to anywhere between 720p and 900p. But still, Rimworld ran fine. So given that we can't run any Source 2 engine games here, I decided the best way to find out how it deals with Source games is probably the most intensive situation I can think for it, which is running Black Mesa during the Zen levels. And admittedly, the system actually had an admirable job at doing it. We did have to use mostly low settings, but we kept a few things like anisotropic filtering on, and kept a few of the other options on medium just to try and make sure the game looked pleasant. We did have to use an 800x600 resolution to prevent the stuttering. Once again, we are using a graphics card with a 64-bit memory bus, but at the end of the day, we managed to get some fairly decent looking visuals out of it, with 36 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 26 FPS, so the frame times were okay. Earlier parts of the game of course would run between 50 and 70 FPS, but the Zen test really is about as intensive as the Source engine gets. Now, I wanted to test Kerbal Space Program because I always used to like testing it on these lower end display adapters, given that it was one of the first games I bought on Steam and played on a Pentium M and Radeon X300 laptop, so I'm fairly knowledgeable about scaling it down. It does seem though, with recent updates, the resolution scale wasn't working particularly well on this graphics card, because it's only when I've gone back to look at this footage that as much as the game was set to be running in 720p with lower settings, it looks like it's running in a full-blown 1080p. Now I tried changing things around with full screen borderless, full screen windowed, and eventually it looked like the settings menu was displaying in 720p. But the game itself looks like it's running in 1080p, so I'm not too sure what's happening here. I'd really disregard this result completely, but it is playable, but something funny was going on with the settings menu. The latest version of Minecraft will actually run with fast settings provided you're using the 800x600 resolution, and also by capping the frame rate at 60 FPS, it did prevent any hitching or stuttering, which was quite prevalent at higher resolutions and if you let the frame rate be uncapped. Because once again, that Core i5, as we've seen before in its own dedicated video, well, as much as it's completely worthless, it is still a really decent processor that can run most older games at high frame rates and even manage newer titles at locked frame rates as well. So really the 6450 was the limit here, but this is a good test showing it can display the game absolutely fine, it can get 60 FPS with the right settings, and it can also handle OpenGL relatively okay for an old Terascale based card. So Minecraft, even in its 2025 form with no performance enhancing modifications, well, you're still going to be seeing 60 FPS. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, with medium settings in 800x600 to try and ensure the game at least had some graphical effects going on, we actually saw a really remarkably decent frame rate of 40 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 34 FPS. Now, given how intensive this game is, it goes to show that the two cores of that Core i5 are dealing with things remarkably well. The 4GB of RAM really isn't a problem here because that would have been considered not overkill but a decent amount back when this game came out, and even that little 6450, well, it's managing to churn out what are some really decent visuals on what is essentially an overclocked potato. So there we have it, Crysis will run on £7 worth of hardware. It's just not going to be the prettiest experience, but it is relatively okay. Now, there are definitely a couple of takeaways from this overall gaming experience, and the first one, which I think is the most important one, is how well Windows 11 actually deals with the RAM utilization, especially on this low-end hardware. Because compared to Windows 10 and Windows 7, which I did used to run GTA 5 on with 4GB of RAM, you'd usually end up with a bit of a stutter fest. It wouldn't run very well at all. But here, with just 4GB of RAM, utilising the Windows 11 RAM engine, or whatever it is, they made some updates to it, is the long story, but it seems to be, on standard Windows 11, those improvements were made purely so they could cram in as much bloat as possible. You're not going to see much of an improvement. But taking those RAM engine improvements and applying it to the IoT version, which is just cut down bare bones Windows with nothing extra bolted on, and you actually see 4GB of RAM is still just about holding in there for even some popular titles today, like GTA 5 and GTA Online. I thought there's no way they're going to run, mostly because of the RAM. But it turns out that the 6450 was more of a limit there. And when it comes to that 6450 as well, it does make an interesting point, because we haven't looked at it for a few years, and as a display adapter, it's actually not too bad at gaming, especially in games from before it was made. So when you're talking Crysis and Skyrim, things like that actually do run remarkably well on something that is just there to produce a display. It's certainly a lot nicer to use than a GT 210. The Core i5 in the system, well, it's the Core i5-2400. They're worthless, but they're capable, and we already knew that. So there's definitely things that can be done with these parts, but the RAM and the graphics card certainly were the limitation, even if I was impressed today. So there we have it, my £7 bundle of parts. And given this is sort of the big month of budget builds, that seems to be what we're doing this month, where we're just covering all those fun topics that the channel is most known for, so really cheap PC builds, odd challenges, and of course, these ridiculously cheap PC part bundles, so it's good to know that we've got one of these videos in for this month. And it's certainly not the most impressive set of parts we've got. I mean, that AM2, it wasn't AM2, it was FM2 system that we bought, where we could actually use the iGPU to get away with some rather competent gaming, was certainly much better value than this. That was about £3. But the thing this system has that doesn't is upgradability, because at the end of the day, I've now got a cheap 1155 setup to use for other projects that came not only with a CPU, but the motherboard and the cooler included for just £7. The fact we got some extra bits makes this more worth it because we've got an extra video out of it. But stay tuned to see these parts show up again for another challenge I've got in mind before the month is over. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the complete nonsense this video became, because this wasn't even meant to be a video. This was just some parts I bought for another project that came with just enough that we could challenge it against the modern day. So I hope you've all enjoyed, and I'll catch you all in another video. So thank you all for watching, and good night.